when the puff of white smoke came from the chimney that's been installed. I didn't know that. I just assume the amount of times I've been to the Vatican, I've always looked up and gone, where the hell is that chimney? Maybe it's on another side of the...
They install it specifically for the conclave.
Brilliant.
I think they don't want the outside air to come in and, I don't know, mess up the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel.
Fair enough. The repaint job would be very expensive. Whether you're a member of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church or not, the selection of the new Pope has ripple effects around the world. Yet, we know very little about this secretive election process. And that's where people like Colleen Dulle come in. She was on the ground in Rome for the conclave in May and has been following Pope Leo closely ever since. So, what political manoeuvring went into his election? And what does the new papacy mean for the rest of us? Stick around for this fascinating conversation with Colleen after a word from our sponsors. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address, because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. Taping this one on a Friday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining me on the line from Norlands, I think as they call it there. I was corrected many times when I was in that beautiful city. She's a Vatican reporter and the associate editor at America magazine and host of Inside the Vatican. And she's actually got a new book out, which you can pre-order. It's called Struck Down, Not Destroyed. And I think we'll be talking about that a bit as well. It's great to welcome on the show Colleen Dulle. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. And good morning to you. Good evening from me.
Yeah, exactly right. Look, and I wanted to get you on. I came across you on Instagram, as many of us do now, find new people through that platform, in the lead up to the conclave, or particularly actually maybe when the Pope had passed, I think. And I desperately wanted to get you on the show to do like a political update of how the conclave was going to work. But we were in the middle of our federal election and shooting out like multiple episodes each week, and I just don't think we could have fit it in the schedule. And then I thought to myself, watching you, and then all of a sudden you were popping up, even not just on my Instagram. I was watching MSNBC one morning, and then you popped up there on a balcony in Rome, and I was like, oh my God, okay, Colleen's a big deal. I don't think she's going to come on the podcast. I think she's a little busy right now.
It was hard to fit anything in the schedule at that point. Yeah, for you and for me.
Thank you. That's very gracious of you to bring me to your level of importance. But we are grateful that you've taken time out of your schedule to come on the show today to talk a bit about the Vatican, the recent conclave, and sort of the future of the church under the new Pope. But before we do that, I'm super interested in sort of learning a little bit more about yourself. Where'd you grow up, and how did you sort of get into this line of journalism?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in St. Charles, Missouri, which is just outside of St. Louis, so pretty mid-sized American city right in the middle of America. And that came with all the kind of political surroundings that you might expect from that kind of upbringing. I grew up Catholic, went to Catholic schools, but with like pretty social justice oriented nuns as my teachers. So I always kind of had a soft spot for that. And the way that I ended up in this role, my best friend remembers when we were in high school, so we were like 16 years old, that I said to her that I thought I would make a good Vatican reporter, which I don't remember saying this at all, but she remembers it. And it was because that was kind of the Benedict papacy era. Everything was really kind of brainy and heady in the Catholic space. And like, if you were a teenager with the internet and lots of questions, you could like go find people having theological arguments online. And so that was what I was really drawn to. And I really liked to take what I was reading and then try to communicate it in an accessible way, because, you know, all of my friends, we were all at the point where you're a teenager, you're starting to question the things that were taught to you. And yeah, I was feeling like I needed to reach my own, you know, reasons and understanding about this faith that I was brought up in. And then also I liked the challenge of communicating that to people who were, you know, maybe not on the same page as the Catholic Church increasingly. And yeah, anyway, I went off to college. I started as a PR major, public relations, thinking I could make some money. Hated it. I remember feeling kind of skeezy when I had to like try to sell people on a thing that I did not believe in. And so switched over to journalism because it felt more objective and like truthful. This is also like a, you know, young, high-minded idealist type of way of being. And then it just so happened that when I was applying for internships, I, you know, was throwing them out everywhere. And the diocesan newspaper in St. Louis was the first one to get back to me and say, hey, we'll give you a job. And I was like, okay, haven't heard back from anybody else yet. Yep, let's do it. Went from there to do 2 summers at an international Catholic wire service called Catholic News Service, which is run by the U.S. bishops, but had a reputation at the time of being sort of center-left. And then went on to be hired by the Jesuits at America magazine. So moved to New York. I did a fellowship for a year. Then they decided to keep me. And that's where I started doing the Inside the Vatican podcast in 2018. But yeah, I never like lost my interest in Vatican stuff. And I think as I was like a senior in high school, that's when Francis was elected. And suddenly he was shaking everything up and saying all this exciting stuff. And it turned out to be a vision of the church that I could really get behind as a young person.
Yeah, I just think about the timing of when Pope Francis became Pope, and certainly in the early days of his time in the Vatican. It must have been a seminal moment for a lot of younger people. Particularly, I felt like it was such a contrast to Benedict.
Yeah, well, a very, very different style, right? Very, very different people. Benedict was your kind of quiet scholar pope, and here's Francis coming in, who's like kind of loud and gregarious and very much a pastor, right? So Benedict, you know, he was into the answers, I think it's fair to say, and Francis, I think, was maybe more into the questions and liked to sit with the questions and liked to give people room to discern their own answers to those questions.
What do you think the legacy of Pope Francis will be? I know it's still very real that with his passing, and I think obviously time will tell what that legacy will be. But you know, you're a journalist, and so you're one of the people that can sometimes shape these legacies. What do you think the legacy of Pope Francis is?
Yeah, I remember when they were doing all the kind of look back stuff on all the American TV networks that I was working with, and they kept calling him the People's Pope. And my mom, who, you know, was a big Princess Diana fan, was like, they're trying to steal the People's Princess and just make it about the Pope. But as I've thought about it more, actually, just before the conclave, I met with the head of the cartoneros, who are kind of the guys who go around Buenos Aires and pick up trash that can be recycled. And they have a union, actually. And the union leader was friends with Pope Francis and had come to Rome for the funeral. So the night before the funeral, I met him. We sat on the Bernini colonnade just outside St. Peter's Square. And he gave me this prayer card that I'm looking at right now. And it has a prayer on the back with a picture of Pope Francis. And it says, "To the Pope of the poor." And that's what I think his legacy is. You know, Francis was the Pope who never shut up about the poor, never shut up about the marginalized. And even when they were preparing like his funeral rites and stuff, the Vatican's liturgy office went out of their way to include people from poor and marginalized communities. And they said specifically, like, as a testament to the special place that these people have always had in this pontificate. And so, yeah, when I look back, I think that that's like really the standout marker of his papacy, even more than a lot of the, you know, synodal reforms, stuff that we can get into later. Yeah.
Is it? Do you think that part of it is because he was a Jesuit, or is it just because it was who he was and and from the place that he came from, and particularly in Buenos Aires?
I don't know. I don't know that concern for the poor is necessarily baked into like the fundamental Jesuit stuff. There was a general congregation that they had in like the 70s where they really decided to refocus the order on that. So I think that would have influenced him. But then I think also, you go to Buenos Aires and like you can be in a bougie, ritzy area, and just, a few blocks away, there will be like 5-story high shanty towns. So I think that in that environment, like the destitute poor are never far from your sight. And Francis certainly, made a priority to like go and visit those places. I think it's interesting, Pope Leo may actually have more experience directly with the poor and like living in poor places, whereas Francis was often a visitor. And so I'm interested to see how that dynamic kind of continues with him, or if it does.
Yeah. So this is obviously a political podcast, and an Australian-based one with a bit of a smattering of an international audience. But many of our listeners, because they are from the Labor tradition, are Catholic, but many, of course, are not. Why should non-Catholics pay any attention to the goings-on of the Vatican, or more broadly the Catholic Church? Where is this interest, do you think, for folks outside of this space?
Well, I think certainly around the conclave, this question is easy to answer because, everyone's got their eye on the spectacle. Everybody wants to know what's happening inside like the world's most secretive election. Yeah. But, in the regular life, I think it's important what a world leader who has no military might, very little financial interest, solely a moral authority, is using their platform to say to other world leaders who he knows are listening to him. There aren't that many figures like this in the world. There's like him, there's the Dalai Lama, and there's like the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, I guess. And so I think that he's able to be a voice on the international stage that's pretty much completely unique because none of those other religious leaders are also heads of a state. And that alone seems worth paying attention to for me, and seems like something that would be of interest to people.
You were, when Pope Francis passed, were you actually in Rome at the time?
No, I was in this room.
Yeah, right. Okay. And so they sent you over to Rome for the conclave then?
Yeah, exactly. So he died on a Monday and I was on a plane on Thursday.
Yeah, wow.
Landed in Rome Friday, the Friday that they closed the casket, actually. So I got there like right before they did that.
Okay, fantastic. So just describe the conclave. I don't think I can get through this section without talking about the film. I'm going to try not to.
The film is actually very accurate in terms of the process. So I saw an interview with Pope Leo's brother saying that he had watched the movie to learn about the process, and like it's actually a good resource for that.
Yeah. Anyway, so yes, I mean, let's get into the conclave. Like, how much does how do you know? Like, how do you know what goes on inside the conclave when it's so secretive?
Leaks, of course. So actually, any cardinal who leaks information about what happens inside the conclave is subject to automatic excommunication, and yet they still leak stuff. So Make of that what you will. But yeah, and I think the motivation, if you ask, people who, my colleague, Jerry O'Connell, who I co-host my podcast with, he's been in Rome since 1985 and has like very strong relationships of trust with a lot of cardinals. And those who have leaked conclave information for him, for his excellent book on the election of Pope Francis, they said it was a matter of like establishing the historical record. Like they knew that this was a really significant election, the first pope from the Americas. Now we have the second pope from the Americas. And, these are guys to whom history is really important. So they will leak stuff out. that all starts coming out pretty fast too. I'll say, like, I'm not a super duper established Vatican reporter because I'm not resident in Rome yet. So I don't have those deep trust relationships. And even to me, cardinal electors were mentioning stuff.
That's amazing. So how did you see the conclave play out? Like, as you're reporting on it, how are you trying to, as a journalist, trying to gather information to report back to the rest of us about what's going on when it's so damn secretive? Like, how do you manage that tension?
Yeah, totally. Well, I can give you kind of a day in the life walkthrough that I think illustrates kind of how we did the reporting. So, like, we had 7 people from my magazine at the conclave. And the first thing we would do in the morning is we split up monitoring the international press based on each of our language abilities. So I was assigned to look at the French media. And we would all go through like the maybe 3 top newspapers. And, we know from working in this field, like who has the best Vatican reporters in that language group or whatever. So we'll check those papers just to keep track of what everyone is reporting, because everyone's talking to as many cardinals as they can get right now. And we'd have a morning meeting. We'd talk through what we had read in the press, and then we'd kind of make our assignments for the day. So like one of our editors was just off doing like Vox Populi, like just talking to people first who were like waiting by Pope Francis' tomb, then like people who were, watching cardinals go into the conclave on the live stream in St. Peter's Square, whatever. Our veteran reporter, Jerry, was spending all of his time talking to cardinals. So a lot of Vatican reporting happens over like coffees or dinners, like off-record conversations. So he was just doing that all the time, filing like 2 interviews a day if he could. And then, let's see, in the middle of the day, I would go and attend the Vatican press briefing, which that happened every day around 1 p.m. in like the week leading up to the conclave. So over time, you had more and more international reporters kind of parachuting in for that. And as more and more people came in, the more basic the questions got, because it was the people who were like going to stay for only a little time and weren't following this closely. So they got increasingly less useful. And then once you get to the conclave, those stop. All communication from the Vatican pretty much stops. The best you're going to get is the chimney. We're all just watching the chimney. And then in the afternoons we would go. So in the morning we would record a podcast, like doing an interview or some analysis conversation. In the afternoon we'd do a quick news update, pop that at the top of the show. And then in the evenings, usually we'd have, dinners with other journalist colleagues or with cardinals or bishops who were in the know, and try to get as much information as we could from each other.
So the moment the conclave happens, correct me if I'm wrong, but none of us can get any access to any of the cardinals that are in the conclave, correct? They would go, they go from like one, they don't have any, I'm assuming they don't have any mobile phones on them. Would that be right?
So here's the thing. In past conclaves, they've had to like hand them in when they check into Santa Marta, which is the Vatican guest house where they stay. In this one, I heard that it was like an honor system, which is crazy and totally insane that there were no leaks. But yeah, I think that they like gave them like a bag to put it in, but they didn't make them like keep them in a central location. Wild.
Okay.
Actually, the Aussie bishop, the Ukrainian guy, the cardinal who was he's like the youngest one in the room. He said somebody asked him at an interview after the conclave, they were like, "What was it like to be without your phone?" And he was like, "It was the best time of my life."
Yeah. I know. It's like when you go camping somewhere and you've got no service, and at the start you're freaking out, but by the end of it, you're loving the whole experience.
I'm like, oh, I never need a phone again. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so no contact, il comunicado. How do you create news then over those 2 or 3 days?
So I think the real plot of like the story we were telling kind of emerged during the pre-conclave meetings. And there was a real plot. Like there was definitely a movement. So at the beginning of those, it's like a week or so of meetings. The people who were very opposed to Francis came in very organized, and they gave their speeches, and they were like, decidedly, we need to roll back the things he's done, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And I think that was with an effort of making the people who had come in from far abroad, because remember, Francis greatly diversified the College of Cardinals, kind of look to these people who seem to be in the know and say, oh, well, if they think that, then they must be right. But it didn't work. So I think the kind of turning point, or one of them, was on the Wednesday before the conclave. One of these cardinals who had been seen as a Francis ally, who had been really trusted by Francis, but who was kind of the campaign manager, you could say. He was like one of the big vocal advocates.
I'm loving you putting it into our language. This is fantastic.
I'm trying to give you the political narrative here. This cardinal who was the campaign manager, Cardinal Stella, he was pushing for Cardinal Parolin, who was the front runner. He was the Secretary of State, so it made all kinds of sense that he would be kind of, one of the central characters next in line for the throne, you could say. Yeah. But Stella comes out making what is read as a pitch for Parolin, saying Francis was totally wrong to open up leadership positions in the church to women, and we need to go back on this. He was imposing his own ideas. And that leaked right out of the room and got tons of pushback. And after that, pretty much all of the speeches were very pro-Francis. And they were like, we need to continue exactly what he was doing. Like, this is the direction he laid out for the church, and we support him. And that makes sense because, again, in political terms, Francis had appointed like more than 70% of the cardinal electors. Of course, they were going to, mostly go his direction. I mean, maybe not, of course. It's not a given, but for those who kind of knew the vibe of that group of people, it was clear that was going to go that way. So, and then, but to answer your question, when they're in the room, no, I mean, you repeat the story, you explain the process of what's happening. That gets you through about the first afternoon and night. And then you just hope it doesn't last too long. Because, I mean, if you get past like a day or two, then you can start saying, oh, well, maybe this is a sign that they're not unified. Like, then you can start hashing out some more of the problems that are happening in the Catholic Church that could be dividing them. But thankfully, this one was over the second day.
Can I ask you about if I can call them factions within the conclave? Can you break down the different groups? Because often, I think sometimes it can be a bit oversimplified, but I am interested in your insights into, the sort of the liberal wing, or the more traditionalist or the conservative. Like, what are the groupings, and broadly speaking, where do those cardinals come from?
It's hard to say. So, people went into the conclave, like, first, I don't know if you saw the, election map, things that people were making going into the conclave, where they tried to map out. Yeah. It was like the seating of Parliament or of the Senate or whatever, with blue dots and red dots and how many has each group. Really, these categories are not super useful when it comes to, one, the Catholic Church and church politics, because there's just so many different issues. But two, we were trying to kind of map out where certain groups of cardinals would end up. And I remember at various points, we would have conversations where it'd be like, oh, well, obviously all the French are going to go for Evelyn, the French cardinal who was the front runner. And then you would talk to some people and you would hear, no, the French are not united. Oh, well, obviously all the Italians are going to be behind Cardinal Parolin and Cardinal Zuppi, the two Italians. Oh, but the Italians are not united. And that would happen over and over again. I remember hearing it about the Latin Americans as well, the Asians. Actually, there was a lot of reporting saying that the Asian bishops were split between the two Filipino candidates. And so it seems like this conclave, those factions and the geographical assumptions for what factions people would be in weren't really working. Yeah, this is not me trying to dodge the question. I genuinely think that it was weird this time.
I wondered if it was oversimplification of what was actually going on, and things are obviously a hell of a lot more complex, right? What was the guiding principle, or if it was a political campaign, the policies that folks could unite around? I got a sense that the tension that was happening was, whatever we do, we have to be, unity is the most important thing for the conclave and for them broadly the church. We can't be seen to be divided, and we don't want to end up having the early foundations of a schism for the church. That's what we need to avoid the most.
Yeah, definitely. That was something that we heard a lot. And I think there was also kind of a narrative that, that was coming, and I don't know if this is exactly true, but that was coming more out of the conservative or like anti-Francis wing of the church. I feel like the best simple paradigm to use to understand the conclave is to say like people who wanted to continue the Francis direction versus who didn't. But that people were using it as kind of a stand-in or like a euphemism for we need to move away from the Francis direction. So the subtext is Francis was a divisive pope, right? And so then you had other like more pro-Francis cardinals coming out in the press trying to push back against that. I can think of at least two who were saying that pretty openly. And yeah, but I don't know. I think that it was a real need for unity, not because Francis was a divisive pope, but because like there is so much polarization in the world and obviously in the church, and like they recognize the need for a counterbalance to that. And I think, they got what they were looking for in Leo. He's, just from day one, he was already on the balcony wearing the papal mozzetta, which is like the red cape that Francis decided to forego, but the pope before him wore. And at the same time, he was up there dropping the word synodality, which I've mentioned a couple times, so now I'll go ahead and define it. But this is basically the like signature Francis reform process. It was kind of put together and articulated at what they called the Synod on Synodality, a synod being like a meeting of bishops, which for the first time, this one included lay people, men and women, as full voting members, which was unprecedented. And the idea of synodality is that you are sharing responsibility between the hierarchy, the bishops, the lay people, all to be co-responsible for the church's mission. And so I was looking at different ways that like we can do that together. And it opened some big questions. Like the question of women deacons was on the table. I know for a fact that in that hall, like in front of the Pope, people talked about ordaining women as priests. So it was this like very exciting like conversation where just like everything was on the table. It started with a global listening process that again was like unlike anything that, not only the Catholic Church has ever done, but like any institution spanning the entire globe has tried to do. So it was incredibly ambitious. It was also kind of open-ended. And to that end, I think like there's going to be a lot of questions about how it gets implemented, especially with a brand new Pope. But Leo has already shown that he, intends to continue in that direction. And so, yeah, I think that we'll continue to see more of that sort of openness, especially to the possibilities of putting women in positions of leadership, trying to share responsibility between the bishops and, the folks in their dioceses, et cetera.
I'm going to ask you a lot of questions in a moment about Pope Leo. So before we do move on to that, though, just a part of this talking about sort of democracy within the church. It's sort of I think folks from outside of the church look at the church and think it's a very undemocratic, theocratic kind of institution or organization. But obviously, at the highest level, there is an election. In order for the Pope to be chosen, it is an election. We just don't see what's going on. It's not like the Australian Labor Party National Conference where everyone's having massive shitfights on the floor of the conference and we can see it all play out, right? So it operates differently. But it is interesting. You're talking about the church starting to move towards a bit more democratization of the church. And I know that sort of I've had arguments with like I remember having an argument with the Archbishop of Adelaide once, and not an argument, but a very respectful discussion, I would say, because he was saying, well, Stephen, we're not a democracy. Like, I know you want it to be a democracy, Stephen, because you're in the Labor Party and that's how you operate, but that's not how the church operates. He was more of a traditionalist, right? And I said, yeah, but Vatican II was about turning around the way that we look at the church, in that it's about the people. And so therefore, in order for you to be the clerics of the people, you need to understand what we want. And so there's this disconnect that's happening. So therefore, democracy is one way of helping that. And we agree to disagree kind of thing. But it feels like Francis was trying to kind of continue that mission of Vatican II.
Certainly. And I think the synod was like the clearest way he tried to do that. I think the democratization thing is kind of a paradox because, it's not so much the will of the people. It's like the discernment of the people and what they think God wants. And at the same time, like the bishops are in this privileged role as kind of discerners in chief. And so, you have this global listening process, you have this like unprecedented assembly, but at the end of the day, like it is at minimum the Pope, but usually also like the bishops who are the ones taking the decisions. And so it's like, there's actually a really interesting part in the Synod's final document, which Pope Francis adopted as like his own and gave it his own teaching authority, even though he hadn't drafted it, which is really interesting since it was in part drafted by women, lay people. But he said, or the Synod said, that if there is a bishop who does a synodal consultation process, a synodal listening process in his diocese, and the process recommends something, and the bishop decides to go in a different direction, he has to give a public explanation of why he didn't do what the Synod recommended. So like, that's a big deal. That's starting to hold bishops accountable to kind of the will and discernment of the people. There was a lot of exciting stuff out of the Synod.
I know that secular Labor Party people listen to this show going, oh, that's not a lot.
I know, I'm so sorry, you guys.
I know in the context of the church, you go, well, that's actually a pretty big kind of thing.
No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the infuriating part of my job, especially, is like things move at a glacial pace in the Catholic Church. People like to say the bark of Peter does not turn on a dime, right? This idea of like, this big boat that the Catholic Church is. But especially covering it week to week, it feels excruciatingly slow sometimes.
Yeah, I can completely imagine.
But then you think of like where we've been in the last, 60 years, and it's like, oh crap, we've got our feet on the accelerator.
Yeah, exactly, because you need to look at the context of the entire apostolic church.
You got to look at a couple thousand years.
Yeah, it's been around a while. Let's talk about Pope Leo.
Sure.
Being on the ground in Rome when the puff of white smoke came from the chimney that's been installed. I didn't know that. I just assume the amount of times I've been to the Vatican, I've always looked up and gone, where the hell is that chimney? Maybe it's on another side.
They install it specifically for the conclave. They like put it up a couple days before and they take it down afterwards. Brilliant. I think they can't. They don't want the like outside air to come in and, I don't know, mess up the frescoes in the Sistine Chapel.
Fair enough. That'd be worth a bit, and the repaint job would be very expensive. So when this puff of white smoke comes out of the Sistine Chapel chimney, what was going through your mind at that moment? Did you have you and all the guys at the podcast and the paper must have had like a betting list of who you thought was going to be the person. Had you? We
may have had a few mock elections over a few aperitivos in Rome a couple nights in a row. I've got some photos of Italian cafe tables just like strewn with pieces of paper with our votes on them.
I mean, of all the places to hang out for an election, geez, Rome must be a tough gig.
Yeah, I can't really complain about that one. The reaction was kind of uneasy at first. So, I was in the Vatican press office because I thought that I had time for a bathroom break, and I did not. So all of a sudden, all the Italians around me start yelling, "Bianca, Bianca!" And I look at the live stream of the chimney that's up, and it's like, oh, holy, that is definitely white smoke. Because in past conclaves, there had been questions. It comes out kind of gray looking, and you're like, oh, I don't know. So immediately I run out the door. I'm like, wow, this is so exciting. But also, this is so soon. And that to me meant it had to be one of the front runners. It was probably Parolin, because he was the front runner going in. The front runners going in were Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State who I mentioned before, who we thought was kind of going to be a continuation of Francis until Cardinal Stella gave his campaign speech and made it clear he was going to be the kind of non-Francis guy. And the other frontrunner was Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, who is he's the one who you probably saw the viral video of him singing Imagine doing karaoke. Yeah. So he's kind of the like heart on his sleeve pastor guy. Like one of my friends joked that if he was elected, he would be the weeping pope because I've seen him cry giving speeches. This is not an unusual thing for him, but very much in the Francis vein. And so it was between the two of them. And the question that like people who really knew what they were talking about was, or what they were asking was, what is their cap of votes? So is there a limit to how many votes that they can reasonably get? And if both of them have a limit that's below the number that they need to win, who will their votes converge on in the subsequent rounds of voting? And so the question was, who would be the middle third option who could emerge? And that ultimately ended up being Leo. I think that's probably exactly how it went down. We're still waiting. The official vote counts have not been leaked out and published yet.
I was going to say, I'm assuming we don't ever see those ballot papers, right?
No, they burn them.
Of course, yes. Yeah.
And actually, everybody keeps a count at their table. So they get a little sheet of paper to put those on. They burn those too. So they burn the ballots themselves and the tracking cards. Yeah. So if you want to sneak them out, you got to really be clever about it.
Eat them. That was something that I found interesting when I watched Conclave, was when they were when they were announcing each round and the vote, and all of the cardinals were making notes of the vote. Yep. I was like, you don't all need to do that. You can just get one person to do that and share it around. But there was obviously a reason why they do that.
Yeah, they do it because there isn't an announcement and they all want to know when a guy gets to the magic number, right? So they can all start clapping and celebrating. And otherwise, you just have to wait until the very end when they like read out, all of the counts. But yeah, so anyway, I was thinking, when it was this early, surely they couldn't have converged on a third option that quickly. And so it must be Parolin or Tagle, and my fear was that it was Parolin. Admittedly, that was a fear because my big interest in who was elected was who's going to be the most fun to cover. And I kept saying, like, if it has to be Cardinal Burke, who is like an ultra traditionalist, like make it him if it has to be, because at least he'll be interesting to cover. Just don't give me like a boring guy. So that was my selfish hope. And the Italians around me were all like, oh, well, obviously it's Parolin. Like they decided this fast, and the Italians always think it's going to be an Italian. So another Italian guy who was just like, working he was like a stage tech for the risers or whatever that the press was on. He was like, yeah, Parolin or Zuppi, of course. So that was like a really uneasy feeling. And then when they announced the name, if we can get into that right now,
go for it.
I think that was also kind of uneasy because he came out and I didn't know that much about him. A lot of people did not know that much about him. And we got the name Leo the 14th. And I remember that between White Smoke and Habemus Papam, there's like an hour in between when everybody's like scrambling to get their bios ready and hope they prepped the right ones. And this ABC America news producer came over to me with a list of possible papal names. So it's like John the 24th, Paul the 7th, Francis the 2nd. And he asked me what each of them would mean. So I, gave him the run through. And when he got to Leo the 14th, I was like, well, this one could go like one of two ways. It could be that he's honoring Leo the 13th, who is like the labor pope. He issued the first big Catholic social teaching encyclical Rerum Novarum, which was fully on the side of workers and unions, the right to organize. It was issued during the Industrial Revolution, so it was like a really key document at that time. At the same time, there are some integralists, so people who want kind of a more theocratic type of government, a government that is subject to the will of the church, who like Pope Leo the 13th's integralist kind of stuff. So he has some stuff against freedom of the press, for example, that gets trotted out sometimes on the internet. And so it was like, oh God, Leo the 14th, like what kind? What kind are you going to be? So that was my worry. And like looking back, I'm like, oh, of course they wouldn't have picked somebody who was going to be like an integralist pope. But he came out and I didn't start to feel at ease until I heard him use the word synodality on like a world stage where like that was a really niche kind of weird word to use. People were not going to understand what it meant, but I was like, oh, that's a key sign that this is a Francis guy. And also he kind of echoed Francis in the very first thing he said. He was like, the very first words were peace be with you. But then the next couple of things he said were peace be with you no matter who you are, no matter where you are, no matter, I don't know, what your life is like. And that felt reminiscent of Francis, who at the end of his papacy was always saying, todos, 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 like the door is open to everyone. So yeah, that's when I started to feel like, oh, like this is the Francis guy.
I think someone had asked me in the days leading up to or during the conclave, would we get an American pope, as in a North American pope? And I said, no way, no how. Like I just thought that
too.
was,
yeah.
That's what stunned me. And I'm still getting used to hearing a pope speak with an English accent, not like
as a native speaker.
Yeah.
Totally. And I mean, and for me, like, because I'm from the Midwest of the United States, like hearing a pope who talks like my grandpa or my uncles is crazy.
Yeah. You've sort of started to touch on what kind of pontiff Leo will be. Obviously, you've made some remarks about his initial statements or prayers from when he was first announced to the world and to the church. What subsequently have you seen from the early days that you as a journalist have been drawing from or grabbing from to see how is he going to shape the church going forward? I mean, obviously there's been, I was on your Instagram account this morning, you were talking about some big things around the abuse within the church. Obviously, I mean, we've got all these big ticket items that I guess a lot of progressive or liberal Catholics, mostly from the Western world, will be looking towards, that we want to see movement on, the role of women in the church, the abuse scandals that have plagued the church for a number of years. Those kinds of things people are looking to get a sense from him about how he's going to, what kind of direction the church will be. What have you gleaned from not just those ones, but others as well?
Yeah. I think he's made clear that his top priority and the thing he's going to advocate for constantly is peace. And I'm very heartened by the fact that he, every time he mentions peace, mentions justice. So he has like a very deeply ingrained sense that, peace is only worth it if it's a just peace, right? An unjust peace is not peace. He has been really vocal against the wars in the world, like every single day this week, I think, had said something about, the need to just today, he was railing against arms manufacturers, which Francis did all the time, which I appreciate. And he keeps talking about how, Christians need to be like united among themselves, need to learn to make peace with and care about each other, because we can't preach unity and peace to a divided world if we are, beefing with each other all the time, which I found a prescient message. Even if it's, it's kind of a start in your own house first type of message. So I think peace is going to be a huge one. Women is one that I'm always watching closely. I just do a ton of reporting on women in the Vatican. It's kind of my special interest. And I was very heartened by the fact that his first big curia appointment was a woman. And I mean, your listeners now have some background for that. Like, this was a big fight in the conclave. And so the fact that, he came out of that, and we know that he's a guy who's so concerned with unity and so concerned with I won't say not rocking the boat, but with like not taking a decision that he thinks will divide people further. The fact that he kind of staked out his position on appointing women to top positions, continuing that part of the Francis legacy, that's encouraging to me. What I've heard is that he is a person who listens broadly before taking a decision. He reflects a lot. He doesn't talk to a lot of people about it, is something that we're starting to learn. Like, there are very few leaks from this papacy. But then when he makes a decision, he's pretty firm in it. I've heard stories now about times he's changed his mind after getting more information or whatever. But for the most part, he listens, he discerns, and then he decides and goes for it. And so I think that that was a sign of that decisiveness, appointing that woman to that top role. And then the other thing that I'll talk about here is the abuse crisis. So obviously, he comes from an American background, that means that he comes from a church where like we've all been trained in safeguarding. In fact, like the US is seen as one of the world leaders in safeguarding and prevention of abuse against minors, especially in the church. And so when I've talked to abuse survivors and victims advocates, what they're saying is like they hope that he was imbued with, you know, some of that culture. Although at the same time, I mean, he hasn't lived in the United States really for an extended period of time since the 2002 Spotlight investigation came out and kind of put this all into the church's, you know, public image and made it something that they were working to address. So I don't know to what extent he feels like he has been enculturated in that culture of prevention. But we've also heard from victims of this abusive lay group in Peru, where members were abused psychologically, sexually, spiritually, financially. He apparently really like put himself on the line for the victims. He chaired for the Peruvian bishops, a like ministry that was specifically tasked with listening to victims and supporting them. And ultimately, once he got to his Vatican job, he was involved in shutting that group down. They were officially suppressed. So that was a big deal. I think that's heartening. There were some questions raised about how he handled abuse cases in Peru. When you talk to other bishops, they say that it was that he handled it all kind of according to the canon law. And then the other question that actually was raised by an American and an Australian victim advocate who I talked to, both of them were talking about how his background as a canon lawyer, so like a church law specialist, might affect his approach to abuse, because one of them, the American woman I talked to, sees canon law as being like slanted towards protecting priests. And she thinks that that's kind of a threat to, you know, what victims could be facing in a Leo pontificate. But then this Australian lawyer that I was talking to was saying, well, it could mean that he knows where the loopholes that need to be closed are. So we're going to have to see, but I do think it's going to be a priority for him. I'm sure that, yeah, it's going to be something that he's trying to make moves on, because he'll be very well aware that like this is the number one, you know, scandal that is plaguing the Catholic Church and is like the number one loss of credibility for the church. And he's going to try to rebuild that, I think.
The other thing is I'm interested in terms of accountability and the sort of reporting of the Vatican. And so particularly your role. I just want to get a sense of how do you think that the Vatican are going to engage with the media? Are they going to be a bit more open and transparent going forward under his papacy?
I don't know. There have been kind of whispers, perhaps wishful thinking on the part of some journalists, saying that maybe he'll try to overhaul the Vatican's communications department. If he did that, then it would be interesting to see who he puts in place. You know, we would all love to see greater transparency. There was an interesting thing where I think journalists and also kind of the public have been complaining for a long time that the Vatican's news operation continued to use art made by this abusive priest, he's being investigated by the Vatican right now. And they were like, why do you keep using this? Why do you keep using this? This one cardinal, American Cardinal Sean O'Malley, on the eve of his 80th birthday, so on the eve of his required retirement, sent out a letter to the whole Vatican saying, you know, basically you guys need to stop using these images. And it went unheeded. And a few weeks into the Leo papacy, those images started disappearing from the website. So that could be a first Leo intervention into how Vatican communications are run. I think on the transparency side and kind of the accessibility side, it'll be interesting. You know, Francis laid out this kind of very open model. He set up his own interviews a lot of the time. He would get up on his papal flights and the way it works is like the Pope's in the like first class, and then like the journalists are filling in the back, and that's how they pay for the flights. The journalists pay a lot of money to get on those flights. But the Pope would come out and do these like freewheeling press conferences and like would say all kinds of stuff on the plane. Leo, I don't know if he'll do that. And I think if he does that, he'll be very, very measured in what he says, just given his personality. So that's a question. And then, there was one more thing that I was going to say. Oh, yeah. And then just last week, the Pope issued this kind of unexpected letter that was read aloud at a production of a play about a Peruvian investigative journalist who had been involved in exposing some of the abuses of Sodalicio, which was this Peruvian lay group that I mentioned earlier that was abusing its members. And this journalist, Paula Ugaz, has faced all kinds of like death threats, lawsuits, etc., over her reporting on them. And Pope Leo sent a message to a play about her life, and it was read on the stage by a Vatican investigator who had been involved in the case. And this is where he spoke very strongly about zero tolerance for abuse, zero tolerance for any cultures of abuse. So like abuse of power, abuse of, financial, whatever. And he insisted that a free press was essential to democracy, which is a heartening message for journalists. So I don't know. These are just like the few bits and pieces we've gotten from him so far on communications. I think we'll have to see where it goes. I don't know.
Time will tell. You've written a book, Struck Down, Not Destroyed, which is coming out in September. Is that right? You can pre-order it. Tell us
August.
A bit about that. What motivated you to write this book, and what essentially is the central thrust of it?
Yeah, sure. It comes out August 12th from Penguin Random House in the US. So I'm not sure exactly the manner of getting it for Aussies.
A note for our listeners. Struck Down, Not Destroyed is available for pre-order through Booktopia and will be out on August 12, the same time as it is in the United States. If you would rather buy locally, then check your local bookstores as release dates may vary.
Essentially, the book goes through... Each chapter is dedicated to some scandal in the Catholic Church that I've covered. And throughout it, I kind of give what the headline was, and then I give some deeper analysis. So like what exactly happened, the story that you probably didn't hear, more analysis of the root causes. But then throughout it, I weave the story of how I was grappling with my own kind of Catholic faith and identity. My question of like, can I in good conscience stay in this institution while covering these things, while having a front row view to these like awful things in the church? And, it doesn't land on any like nice, clean answer. I think the best answer I end up reaching is that like, there is inherent value in wrestling with the spiritual hurdle that the Catholic Church represents. I have this kind of dichotomy between it being a spiritual home and a spiritual hurdle. And yeah, I think my main goal of it is, that I have these conversations all the time with people who see the headlines about the Catholic Church, some of them written by me, and they're like, this is just like embarrassing to even be associated with. This is like, this is a place where I have found so much beauty or so much meaning at some point in my life. And like now it just disappoints me over and over. I hear that all the time, and I feel it much of the time. And I just want to help people feeling that way, like know that doesn't make them a bad Catholic. It doesn't, like they're not alone in struggling with that and feeling that way. And hopefully it can help them realize, that other people are struggling, other people are going through that wrestling process. And I argue like that wrestling process is just kind of part and parcel and is sort of a moral requirement of anybody who, is a thinking person in the Catholic Church today.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to reading it. And it's something I think a lot of what you've just shared there with us is something that a lot of other, obviously, Catholics have grappled with as well. I often think about the song by Christy Moore. There's a line in there that says, "The men of cloth have failed us again." And I often feel that way because, you do talk about, like, I mean, particularly anyone who's been raised in the Catholic faith, it's not just going to Mass on Sundays. It's obviously, 13 years of education because you probably attended a Catholic primary school and a Catholic high school. It's cultural. I've got friends that have sort of said, I'm not a practicing Catholic, but I'm still culturally Catholic. I can't shed those experiences. So even if I may not practice the faith, I certainly identify with the faith, and I get angry when I see or read about, particularly the sexual abuse within the church.
Absolutely, that is chapter 1.
Yeah, and that's not even going into the mistreatment of women or the role of women in.
That's chapter 2.
Yeah, and so you read that. Yeah, I can imagine, right? You go, why am I in this organization?
And it's a question that I've had to ask myself often, especially as somebody who's like publicly affiliated with this organization, right? Like, it's hard.
As a teaser for folks let's get them to buy this book of yours, can you share us one interesting story from the book that will draw people in on going, I wouldn't mind reading that?
Yeah, sure. In the second chapter on women in the church, which I've mentioned is one of my favorite things to report on, I spent a lot of time talking about kind of the high up appointments of women and how there were new doors open to them at various points and what that meant and like the tension between that and the question of women's ordination. But I really try to prioritize in that chapter the stories of women who like do not end up in the newspapers who are working in the Vatican. And so I talk about these nuns who are the cooks and cleaners in the houses of bishops and cardinals in and around the Vatican. And there was some incredible reporting by actually a women's magazine that was attached to the Vatican newspaper. So published by the Vatican, there's this kind of feisty feminist historian turned journalist called Lucetta Scarafia. And she and her team did a bunch of reporting into the situations of these women and uncovered first the labor abuses that the women were facing. So oftentimes they were from Africa or Asia and had sort of precarious immigration situations. And she also talked to some women who their families were like basically receiving money from the religious order that their daughters had joined, in order to support them, because usually you would have like your child kind of contributing to the care of the parents. And because of these two like factors, they didn't feel that they could speak out against the people who were essentially like trafficking them for labor or simply like, using them as extremely cheap or unpaid labor, which also is not what anyone becomes a nun to do, right? You do it because you're passionate about the thing that you could be teaching and preaching and, working for. And Lucetta and her team then went on to reveal in a subsequent report the sexual abuse that some of these women faced at the hands of the cardinals and bishops who employed them. They talk about some of the cardinals and bishops. I don't remember if cardinals were involved in this specifically, but in one case, paying for a woman to have an abortion after they got her pregnant. And this story comes out, and suddenly all eyes are on this tiny Vatican women's magazine, and they face a ton of pressure to step back from the reporting. I was told that a very high-ranking cardinal told them, stop pursuing this. And instead, they went ahead, they published it, it became international news, and then the entire editorial board of the magazine resigned in protest. Like, I just think it's an incredible story. It's one, like, it's not original reporting of mine, the story has been out there, but just, I found that extremely inspiring and also, like, important to put the spotlight on these women who are kind of at the bottom of the Vatican ladder. So that's just one story from the book.
I'm sure we can buy it in Australia through some kind of online order system. So we'll drop the link in the show notes as well. So we really encourage you to do that. We'll put Colleen's social media links in the show notes as well. I really encourage you to follow Colleen. I think I might have found you through Father James Martin. I follow him on Twitter. And then maybe
we're co-workers. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Very, very close with Jim.
And there's another person. Actually, that's a good suggestion. Who else on social media do you think that would be interesting to sort of follow in terms of getting sort of Vatican news or updates on what's going on inside the church these days that you would recommend for folks to read, or other sources of information that would be worthwhile to read?
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to Elise Allen. She writes for a Catholic outlet called Crux. She's a very good reporter, but she is uniquely positioned to cover this papacy super well. She is actually a former member of the Sodalicio, and so spent some time in Peru, speaks Spanish well, is also American like the Pope. And so I think she has a lot of like cultural background knowledge that is going to make her really excellent at covering this Pope in the same way that like many Argentine journalists were the best ones to follow during the Francis papacy. So yeah. Elise and Allen.
Excellent. I will get Grace to drop that in the show notes as well. My final question really is very much sort of in the mold of a Bill Simmons type podcast question, which is top 3 popes of all time personally for you. Yeah. I don't know.
Oh my God. I did not come prepared for this question. I'm not a historian. I have very little like historical knowledge. So I'm going to be missing entire swaths of them.
Even in modern era, like I'm not expecting to go back to the Middle Ages or anything, but even in your own.
Okay, dope. There were a lot of bad popes in the Middle Ages, so we can mostly skip that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go Francis, John the 23rd.
Mm-hmm.
Do I need to explain my choices?
Yeah,
probably. Yeah. Okay, John the 23rd, who was the one who, his famous quote is on the eve of Vatican II. So like in the 1960s, this big process of opening the church to the outside world, he said, let us open the windows of the church to let the Holy Spirit in, basically saying that it was kind of cobwebbed up, stale institution. Yeah. And I guess my number 3 choice would be, I guess I'll go Leo the 13th for Rerum Novarum, since we're on the Labor podcast.
Very good. Well done. Very good. My my RE teacher at Marist, Mrs. Murphy, who her own story is actually quite interesting. You won't know this, Colleen, but her son went on to play AFL football. Like it's like the NFL. It's like the NFL, but in Australia. Mrs. Murphy said to us in class one day, we had an RE test, and she was saying how important John the 23rd was to the modernization of the church. And she
Absolutely.
said, and she said, he is my favorite pope and the most important pope at the time. And JP2 was the pope at that moment, right? Mm-hmm. And she said, he is so important to you, students, that if you don't know an answer on this test, and if you simply write John the 23rd, I will give you a correct score for it. That's how important he is to the modernization of the church. And I was I don't even know who the guy is. I need to find out more about this. And I did the test, and there was one question. I was like, I'm stuck. I don't know the answer to this. I wrote John the 23rd. She gave me a tick.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know who my honorable mention is John Paul I, the one who was Pope for 28 days. I think that he could have brought about a lot of reforms. I mean, obviously that's just like, you can look into his very short papacy and think whatever, like everybody can choose to think that he was their guy. Right. But I would have loved to see what would have happened had he lived.
I think he's similar to Bobby Kennedy in the kind of what if he wasn't shot in California after the California primary.
Yeah. Yeah.
So much we don't know. Another probably unanswerable question. Colleen, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a lot of fun, incredibly insightful. I have so many more sort of trivial questions that I wanted to ask you about, like hanging out in Rome on rooftops during the conclave, but I just feel like it was I wanted to get into a bit more meatier stuff, but this has been great. I really appreciate you taking time. Please,
it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Buy the book when it comes out. Follow Colleen on social media if you're interested in this particular topic. And we wish you the best of luck with your continued reporting of Pope Leo's papacy.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Special shout out to our two new members of our socially democratic Patreon community, Eddie Smith and Don Brown. We appreciate your support and thanks for joining our Patreon community. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.